Okay, so there's an issue that's been brought up in the news today about women in prison. It's in the news because the Liberal Democrat Minister Simon Hughes is proposing to halve the number of women in prison in Britain. I'll go give you some information from the BBC article on this. Apparently there are 3,800 women in prison roughly in England and Wales. England and Wales are a separate judicial system than Scotland and Northern Ireland, so it's not including the figures from there, but presumably it would be not a great deal more. So let's say in the UK altogether maybe around 4,500, something like that. But anyway, that is dwarfed by the number of men in prison, which is, I don't know the exact figure, but I've seen it quoted around 80,000 or more. So it's obvious the vast majority of inmates are men. That's just context that I think is very important to keep in mind. Now what Mr. Hughes is saying is this. There are so many women who ought not to be in prison. About half ought not to be there at all, the minister said. I met a woman in her 20s the other day who clearly ought to be sectioned. Her problem is a health problem, not a criminality one. Prisons shouldn't have to cope with that. When asked why female offenders should be treated differently to men, Mr. Hughes said, women are a special case for very good evidence reasons. Firstly, many more women who go to prison have themselves been victims. They have often been abused or in violent partnerships. Secondly, many more women have caring responsibilities than men do. Now he did say this. He said, there are some women who do terrible things and deserve to be locked up for a very long time, he said. My concern is for those who are not a danger to society, who have become caught by a system which then does not help them get out of it. Mr. Hughes was speaking ahead of an announcement expected to say that a scheme in Manchester to stop women ending up in prison will be rolled out to 6 other areas in England. Okay, there's a few things that I want to mention about this. Firstly is the obvious one. There's this focus on women in prison, and it's certainly not the first time this has been raised. It's been raised by feminists time and time again. The obvious thing here is that the majority of inmates are men, but they're focused solely on women. Now, I really have a problem with that, because I don't see how you can preach equality and then say that women don't have the same responsibility men do. Now, the sort of rationale that Simon Hughes is using for this, i.e. women inmates have mental health problems, they're mothers, and they've been in abusive relationships. Certainly the first two factors can be used in the case of men. Many male inmates arguably have mental health problems, and many male inmates are fathers. But to me that just suggests the fact that we as a society look down on the role of fathers, or don't take it as seriously as the role of mothers. In other words, you know, if a man goes to prison, the idea that has no impact on his children, the fact that's being ignored is rubbish. Secondly, there's this idea that mental health problems. Well, again, there's a lot of male inmates with mental health problems. The third one, more domestic abuse. Well, okay, maybe the evidence shows that more women have been abused, but it's overlooked that men are much less likely to report it, because there is a stigma about men getting abused, i.e., he's a big tough man, he can take it and all that sort of stuff. This is well established. Excuse me. So I just think it's a bit phony to say that there's these problems for women, but male inmates don't face the same problems. Now, just to be clear, I'm not heartless. I'm not of the sort of flog 'em and hang 'em brigade, and there may well be women inmates whereby a custodial sentence isn't the appropriate sentence if it's a non-violent crime. I don't believe that any crime should go unpunished. I believe any crime that has been done through choice, well, any crime, but especially any crime done through choice, should have consequences. What Hughes seems to be saying is they should be treated solely as victims. Now, being in an abusive relationship is a terrible thing. I think domestic violence is abhorrent, but that still doesn't justify shoplifting. If you've got a violent husband, that's terrible, and I think women like that should get help, but it still doesn't justify taking it out on someone else, which essentially is what we're talking about. I mean, exactly the same argument could be made for male inmates. That a lot of male inmates probably had abusive parents as well. We're talking about female inmates having abusive partners. How about male inmates, in many cases, maybe having abusive mothers? So to me, this is utterly sexist, and I wouldn't have a problem with it so much if it was consistent. The fact that Hughes is saying there's a difference between men and women is odious. He's a left-winger. I don't know if he sees himself as a feminist or not. The reason I'm bringing feminism into it is because this has always been a feminist cause celebrated. So despite all their harping on about equality, they actually don't believe in equality, and this shows it. Like I said, I'm not heartless. I believe that if there's vulnerable women in prison, obviously you can't just throw them in with a tough girl gang. Prison needs to be humane. It needs to be reflective of the crime that's happened, and I believe all crimes should face consequences. But to me, this is just like, all women inmates are victims. The Hughes is saying some are violent, but saying just some, I think, is an underestimate. There's a lot of violent women in this country, actually, who think they'll get away with it because they are women. And it could be argued there are many women who commit serious crimes who don't face prison and should. To give you some examples, women who lie about rape. There has been examples of women doing that and escaping a custodial sentence. In other cases, they have got a custodial sentence. But just because a crime doesn't involve violence doesn't mean it's not damaging. So if a woman lies about rape, and I'm not saying every woman does, okay, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there have been examples. That's technically, it's not a violent crime. She's not assaulting anyone, but she is destroying a life. So why the hell should a woman like that escape justice? And I think it's actually, once again, it's treating women like irresponsible children and completely ignoring men. There should be a humane approach to justice. It should be tough, but humane. And if there are issues, for example, with mental health problems and so on, there might well be a debate that there shouldn't be custodial sentence in some of those cases. I can understand that. What I don't accept is the double standards. I think it's bullshit. And I would have strong words with Simon Hughes about this. I've had some experience with female thugs, and let's not pretend ourselves that they are any less of a problem for society than male thugs. I'm talking about women who drink a lot and get into fights, and I've experienced this sort of women. Thankfully not very much, but the idea that they don't exist is absurd. And when feminists, I'm not talking specifically about Simon Hughes, but when feminists talk about women in jail, to me, I'm thinking hypocrisy. Utter hypocrisy. So if you're going to come out and say, oh, it's about mental health, it's about being victims themselves, etc., you could use exactly the same excuses for male inmates. Being a victim of something is not an excuse to then take it out on someone else. So like I say, if a woman has been a victim of domestic abuse, it's a terrible thing, and her partner should be punished. But that doesn't then give her the green light to go and rob a small business. So where's the responsibility here? It pisses me off. So just in conclusion, I'm not being heartless. I'm not saying if someone commits a crime, they should be just thrown behind bars and forgotten about. If there are vulnerable inmates, male or female, then yeah, they should be treated in a certain way. I do agree with that. I think that's common sense. What I cannot stand about this is the double standards of it. Like a lot of these things, I'll put a link to the article. Let me know your thoughts. To me, it's just utter double standards. And actually, there was a woman academic, female academic, who actually, I think it was the University of Lancaster, she actually said this is misguided because it sends out the false message that all women are victims. And she actually said categorically, actually, they're not. This idea that all women are victims is just rubbish.